In the vast expanse of the American frontier during the late 1800s, where the golden prairies met the endless blue sky, there lived a young farmer named Thomas Whitmore. He had inherited a modest piece of land from his late father, a stretch of earth that demanded every ounce of his strength and determination to cultivate. Thomas was a solitary figure, not by choice but by nature. His shy disposition made it difficult for him to engage with others, especially women. At 24 years old, he had never courted anyone, never held a woman's hand with romantic intention, and the very thought of such intimacy made his cheeks flush red as the desert sunset. His farm sat on the edge of what had once been Apache territory, land that held memories of a people who had been forcibly removed just a generation before. The government had opened these lands for settlement, and settlers like Thomas's father had claimed their portions, building their dreams on ground that still whispered with the songs of its original inhabitants. Thomas knew little of this history when he first began working the land. He was too focused on survival, on coaxing crops from the stubborn soil, on maintaining the few head of cattle that grazed near his simple wooden homestead. Everything changed on a spring morning when he discovered a young woman collapsed near his water well. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen, with long black hair braided intricately down her back, wearing traditional Apache clothing that spoke of a heritage he barely understood. Thomas's first instinct was fear, then concern. Despite his shyness, his fundamental decency wouldn't allow him to leave anyone in distress. He brought her water, helped her to the shade of his porch, and waited nervously as she regained her strength. Her name was Nahale, which meant forest in her language, though there were precious few forests in this arid landscape. She explained, in halting English that surprised Thomas with its competence, that she had been traveling alone, that she had family obligations to fulfill, and that fate had brought her to his doorstep. Thomas, stammering and awkward, offered her food and a place to rest. He expected her to leave by morning, to disappear back into the territories where her people had been relocated, but Nahale remained. Over the following days, an unusual relationship developed between them. Nahale was direct in a way that terrified and fascinated Thomas in equal measure. She asked him questions he had never been asked, observed him with an intensity that made him constantly aware of his every movement. She helped with tasks around the farm without being asked, showing knowledge of the land and its plants that far exceeded his own. She taught him which wild herbs could be used for medicine, which roots were edible, how to read the sky for weather changes with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Thomas found himself drawn to her presence despite his natural reticence. She didn't seem to mind his long silences or his inability to make casual conversation. In fact, she seemed to prefer it. They worked side by side during the days, and in the evenings, she would tell him stories of her people, of their traditions and beliefs, of a way of life that was rapidly disappearing from the world. Thomas listened with a growing sense that he was being entrusted with something precious and fragile. 3 weeks after her arrival, on an evening when the stars seemed particularly bright and the air carried the promise of summer, Nahale spoke words that would forever alter the course of Thomas's life. They were sitting on the porch after a long day's work, the comfortable silence between them broken by her clear, steady voice. "I want a child from you," she said simply, as though she were asking him to pass the water pitcher. Thomas nearly fell from his chair. His face turned crimson, his hands began to shake, and for a moment he couldn't form words at all. When he finally managed to speak, his voice came out as a strangled whisper. What? I don't, ma'am, Nahale continued calmly, as if she hadn't just proposed the most shocking thing Thomas had ever heard. She explained that she was the last of her immediate family line. Her parents had died during the forced relocation. Her siblings had succumbed to disease in the reservations where conditions were harsh and unforgiving. She had obligations to her ancestors, she told him, obligations to ensure that her bloodline continued, that the stories and knowledge she carried wouldn't die with her. She had chosen Thomas, she explained, because she had been observing him. She had actually been watching his farm for several days before that morning when she had appeared at his well. She hadn't really collapsed from exhaustion. That had been a pretense to make contact. She had seen in him something that was rare among the settlers, respect for the land, a gentle nature, and a fundamental kindness that expressed itself in how he treated even his animals. These were qualities she wanted in the father of her child. Thomas sat frozen, his mind reeling. Everything about the situation defied every social convention he had been raised with. The proper thing would be to refuse, to explain about courtship and marriage, about how such things were supposed to proceed through proper channels with proper timing. But as he looked at Nahale's face, calm and serious in the lamplight, he found he couldn't summon the words of refusal. Instead, he asked questions. His voice shook, but he asked them nonetheless. What would this mean? Would she expect him to marry her? Would she stay on his farm? What about the child? Would he be a father in truth, or merely a means to an end? The questions tumbled out, each one born from his confusion and his unexpected hope that perhaps this strange proposition might mean he wouldn't be alone anymore. Nahale answered each question with patient honesty. She would marry him if that was what his culture required, though her people's traditions were different. She would stay and help build a life with him, but she would also ensure their child knew both heritages. The child would be loved by both of them, raised with the best of both worlds. She wasn't asking for a brief encounter. She was proposing a partnership, unusual though it might be. Thomas spent a sleepless night wrestling with his thoughts. His shyness screamed at him to refuse, to send her away, to retreat into the safe solitude he had always known. But another part of him, a part he hadn't known existed, yearned to say yes. He thought of the long, lonely winters on the farm, of the growing certainty that he would live and die alone because he could never summon the courage to court a woman in the traditional way. Here was Nahale, offering him something he had never dared to dream of, asking nothing more than his willingness to try. By morning, he had made his decision. He found Nahale preparing breakfast as though the previous evening's conversation had never happened, as though she hadn't just asked him the most momentous question of his life. He stood in the doorway, gathering every ounce of courage he possessed, and said simply, "Yes." What followed was not a conventional courtship by any measure, but it was their own. Thomas rode into town with Nahale to see the circuit preacher, enduring the stares and whispers of townspeople who couldn't fathom what the shy farmer was doing with an Apache woman. They were married in a simple ceremony that satisfied the legal requirements of the territory, though Nahale insisted on a second ceremony of her own tradition, performed under the open sky with words in her language that Thomas didn't understand but felt in his heart. Their marriage was a source of scandal in the nearby town, but on their isolated farm, they created their own world. Thomas's shyness never fully left him, but with Nahale, it mattered less. She understood his silences, his need for quiet, his difficulty expressing emotion in words. She taught him that love could be shown through actions, through working side by side, through small kindnesses and mutual respect. True to her word, Nahale became pregnant within a few months of their marriage. As her belly grew, so did Thomas's wonder and terror at the approaching responsibility of fatherhood. Nahale remained calm throughout, teaching him about the traditions of her people regarding childbirth and child-rearing, while also learning about his culture's expectations and practices. When their daughter was born on a crisp autumn morning, Thomas held her with shaking hands and knew that every moment of awkwardness and fear had been worth it. They named her Sarah Nahale Whitmore, bridging both their worlds in the syllables of her name. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's lighter hair, a visible manifestation of the two cultures coming together. The years that followed were not without challenges. They faced prejudice from some quarters, questions about their daughter's identity and belonging. But Thomas found that fatherhood gave him a courage he had never possessed before. When someone spoke ill of his wife or daughter, his shyness evaporated, replaced by a fierce protectiveness. Nahale taught their daughter the stories of her people, while Thomas taught her about farming and animal husbandry. She grew up bilingual, bicultural, belonging fully to both worlds and neither, creating her own unique identity. Looking back on that evening when Nahale had spoken those shocking words, Thomas often marveled at how a single moment of courage had transformed his entire existence. The shy farmer who could barely speak to women had become a husband and father, not through the conventional path he could never have navigated, but through an unexpected proposition from a remarkable woman who had seen in him qualities he hadn't known he possessed. Their farm prospered, a testament to their combined knowledge and efforts. And though the world around them continued to change, though the frontier closed and the old ways faded, they maintained their small pocket of harmony where two cultures merged in mutual respect and unexpected love.